You're listening to NorthWoods Church Matters, a podcast of NorthWoods Church in Evansville, Indiana, where we discuss why the local church matters and things that matter to the local church. I'm your host, Matt Higgins. Hey guys, well, welcome back to the NorthWoods Church Matters podcast. We've got a more serious, somber podcast today. Some of you guys have seen the news, and the Southern Baptist Convention has been in the news lately because of a report that Southern Baptists initiated of ourselves, more specifically the executive committee. And that report came out and detailed how Southern Baptists over the years have responded poorly in regard to sexual abuse. And so we wanted to take a moment and respond to that. But before we get in the weeds of the details of that report, I feel like we need to just talk about just some Southern Baptist basics. And by the way, we've got Bobby Pell and Darin Garten here. And so first question that we're going to deal with is a question of polity. And that's a churchy word, a seminary word. But when we talk about polity, what polity means is how things are governed. Can you guys explain for us the polity or how the SBC is governed?
Every church is governed by its leadership that it establishes. A church is its own autonomous entity, which is what we say is every church has the right to choose its budget, elect its leaders, all those sorts of things. And so Southern Baptists as a denomination are a group of people who voluntarily come together, some 47,000 churches that agree to cooperate together on the basis of missions and outreach and some material presentation and those sorts of things. The way we are governed, it's not like maybe some other denominations are governed in the sense that there is a hierarchy and there are leaders higher up in the denomination that really can tell a church exactly what they are to do. That's not the way we're set up. Every church does what it wishes, but we have a way of governing where it's governed by the people. So the Southern Baptist Convention is really those churches, but the convention exists really only those 2 days a year when the convention gets together to conduct its business. I think in Nashville last year, there were 15,000 messengers that come together to represent the interests of their church. So they vote on what they think that the Southern Baptists should be doing, or emphases and so forth. But when the convention is not in meeting, the convention itself doesn't exist. But what they have is a group of people that act on behalf of the convention, and that's called the executive committee. And so the executive committee, there's a CEO. He is the person who conducts business. I think there are about 30 people on this committee that receive money from churches. They conduct the business of the convention, and they operate as the convention until they meet again the next year.
So it's a little bit wonky, but the highlight is that we're all independent churches. We just choose to cooperate together. And for the sake of our cooperation, there just has to be certain entities that are in place to run day-to-day business. One of those is the executive committee, which manages the business of the convention. But then there's other entities that people are more familiar with, which are the North American Mission Board, the International Mission Board, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission.
Our seminaries.
That's it. Otherwise, all the business of the SBC handles at the local level.
The two big issues are that we're not top down, we're bottom up.
Right.
And that proof of that is that nobody tells any church what it can and what it cannot do, as we are autonomous. So some churches in our communities, and there's one over on Oak Hill Road, that left its denomination, and they had to have a conversation with the denomination about what to do with the property.
Mm-hmm.
Because technically the property was owned by the denomination. That is never the case in SBC life.
Yeah.
In SBC life, each church has its own stuff.
And has a say in the business of the convention. When the convention is in order, any person can come to a mic. Any person can have a voice to address concerns, and then the convention as a whole decides whether it's something that we feel like we want to do or not do.
To start off this way is important because I think people often get confused because the SBC is not like other denominations, that there is not anybody telling us what to do, that we are a group of independent churches. That's important. So let's talk a little bit more about what the executive committee is, because that really is the centerpiece of this report. So what is the executive committee and what are they supposed to do?
I'd say that there's two pieces to this. There are people who are appointed to be a part of the executive committee every year by messengers who are nominated by a nominating committee.
They're trustees.
They're trustees. That's right. Those people come from different states. They're pastors or they're lay leaders, but they serve to represent the rest of the convention when they meet, which I believe is 2 other times throughout the year. Grateful for their willingness to serve. They're not paid. They're volunteers who are simply willing to give their time to serve the other 45,000 plus churches.
To use a business analogy, like they're like the board of directors.
That's correct.
Of a business, or in a county analogy, they're like your county administrator.
Right, but there is accountability in the sense that there are 86 trustees who receive reports from the executive committee about what's going on, what are we doing, and those are the checks and balances where those trustees come from every state all around the country. They hear what's going on and they speak into what the executive committee is doing.
Yeah, so Indiana has a seat or a spot on the executive committee.
That's correct. I attended one of those meetings 2 or 3 years ago when I served as the president of the state convention. The executive committee is divided up into different committees, and I attended the cooperative program meeting. It was enjoyable for me because basically what happened during that day, North American Mission Board representatives came to that group. International Mission Board representatives came to that group. Seminaries came to that group. Each seminary came to that group. The ERLC. Everybody came and they communicated, here is why you should continue to give cooperative program dollars to what we are doing on behalf of the Southern Baptists. And that committee was able to ask them questions on behalf of our churches. And I thought they did a great job. There is a second piece to that committee, and that is that there are people who, as Darin alluded to earlier, there's a CEO, someone who represents Southern Baptists throughout the year, and staff who assist the different functions that happen throughout the year. Right now we have an interim. His name is Willie McLaren, and the first ever African American is in that position. There's about 30 people who serve out of that office in those staff roles. Their office is in Nashville, Tennessee. So that would be a little bit of a picture.
And it's important to get that picture as we dig into this, because that's really, as I said, the centerpiece of this report. So what circumstances led to the call for an investigation of the executive committee at the last convention?
When you read the report, you see this. Years of ignoring problems until there came a point that messengers basically came to a place of enough.
Mm-hmm.
And as they came to a place of enough, they determined that they needed to force the convention to address the issue of sexual abuse.
There have been people making reports, and the reports had either been screened out or put off, or they didn't feel like the executive committee had been responsive to those things. And it got to a place where enough people were made aware of it that the messengers wanted to know what was going on. And so at the Nashville convention, anything can come before the convention for a vote. And there were several people that were saying, we want to hear what's going on with this. Why aren't people who are making reports about sexual abuse or assault, why aren't these people being heard? We want to know what's going on. And so the messengers voted at that convention to ask for an independent committee to review what's been going on related to sexual abuse reports within the convention.
And really the kerfuffle at the last convention was the executive committee basically said, we're going to conduct an investigation of ourselves regarding sexual abuse. And then the messengers voted to correct that and say, we want an independent investigation and not for the executive committee to investigate themselves.
Yeah, I think it's important that those who are hearing, once again, I recognize this is going to get in the weeds here, but there was a motion made for there to be a investigation. And when there is a motion made at these things, they can be ruled in or out of order. And that motion ultimately was ruled out of order. And the person who made the motion comes back and he wants to appeal that to all of the messengers, and the man's name was Grant Gaines, who was a pastor in Tennessee, and the messengers almost unanimously overruled what was ruled out of order, in effect saying, no, we as pastors and messengers and churches, we want this investigation. And later there was another that said, well, we'll let you investigate it yourself. And then there was another motion that said, we want there to be an independent investigation from an outside source. And that was ruled out of order. They did the exact same thing again. So the messengers caused this. And I think that's really important that we hear this, because to a great degree, what's come out has come out because pastors and churches and messengers have forced it to come out.
That was a great moment for the SBC last year because, as you said, pastors and local churches forced an investigation of the executive committee, that there was something certainly smelled bad. There were rumors going around, and we wanted to get to the bottom of it and know the truth.
Well,
Right.
if you're at the convention, you can have this feel that things are being rubber stamped. It's just like people are reporting and people are just saying, okay, we agree, we agree, agree. And that was a real moment where people were hearing what was going on and really brought this to the attention as something that we should investigate. And grateful they did that.
Yeah. So what do the reports say regarding the executive committee and sexual abuse? Was there fire where the smoke was?
It certainly looks like there was some fire. What's being reported is that they did have a database that they at least unofficially kept that had names of people that they did not release to churches. I think that is probably one of the things that's not great. I will say, and Darin, you may have some of the numbers on this. I don't have them on the top of my head, but one of the pieces that's positive to this is that there wasn't a ton of active Southern Baptist pastors, if you would, who were on that list.
It wasn't a list of thousands of people.
No, I think that they, at least at this time, again, it's an unofficial list, so it's not the total picture, but so 47,000 churches over 20 years. So that's a lot. And they said there were 700 accusations of sexual abuse in some way, and about 400 of those were among Southern Baptist churches. Only 2 cases where someone was continuing to serve in another church after a report was happened, which to me is encouraging that it wasn't more than that. Now, there's not a lot that's been reported because it was an unofficial list, but that's a very, very small number. It's too many, obviously, but it was a situation where there was some pastors that it was not dealt with the way it was supposed to. And I think that's one of the things that the report brought out is the fact that if not the executive board or the executive committee, some of the leaders in the executive committee were hiding behind this idea of church autonomy, that we can't do anything related to the churches because every church is autonomous. And that is true. That is true. But they were abdicating their responsibility for addressing that on that basis. And what ended up happening is that several reports were brought to the leadership there, and they were either dismissed or put off and weren't really dealt with as seriously, I think, as they should have been. I think that's what the report showed, that either they were delayed or they were told they would do something when they didn't end up doing something. And that was not great.
The report goes back 20 years and not past 2000. But one of the things that a report details is that abuse survivors and abuse groups and their attorneys have been asking the Southern Baptist Convention for years to maintain a list of people who have committed sexual abuse, specifically pastors who have committed sexual abuse, that churches could use to make sure that they're not hiring somebody who has committed an offense in the past. And the response of the executive committee has always been, due to legal liability and due to the autonomy of the churches, we're not going to do that. But in the background, the report reveals that they were doing that. They just weren't releasing it to churches or being willing to help churches not hire past sex offenders.
Right. And I also would say that one of the things that the report brings out is that people who had been sexually abused were not necessarily treated well
Yes.
by the executive committee.
Yes.
And when I say executive committee overall, I do not mean those volunteers who served. I do mean people who were paid representing SBC working in Nashville.
Yeah.
There were some lawyers there who certainly viewed everything through the eyes of how do we not get sued, rather than viewing things through the eyes of how do we help these folks just biblically, and how do we help them experience wholeness and healing through this. And I recognize lawyers have a legal responsibility. That's why they're lawyers.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, we are a convention of churches. We are not purely a business. That was disheartening.
Yeah, they didn't help the story get out either. I think the one thing with the Baptist Press, which is a part of the executive committee's oversight, instead of helping someone tell their story, there's an incident where they sort of changed the story to make it more palatable so that it doesn't look as bad. And that didn't help those people who were victims. And so that came out as something that was not a win for us.
And something I think that we should put out there in terms of the numbers is, while we're saying that the reported number of sexual abuse cases is small, we realize that there is shame and pain and suffering associated with sexual assault and sexual abuse, and that many people who have experienced this never come forward. Right. And especially in a culture which has been perpetrated so long, some Southern Baptist churches, some Southern Baptist entities where people have seen sexual assault or sexual abuse downplayed, there may be some reluctance of people to actually come forward and report what's happened. And my hope and my prayer is that this will create an opening for people to talk about things that have legitimately happened to them, where they feel validated and we can come to grips with stuff that has actually happened. And we want people to feel comfortable saying, this has happened to me. Maybe this will create some level of comfortability for people to come forward now that they feel like they're not going to be roasted at the stake for coming forward about these things. Any other highlights from the report, or lowlights?
I think lowlights is definitely the word of the day on the report. I should quickly say I'm actually grateful for the report. I mean, until things come to light, you can't fix anything.
Yeah.
I'm grateful that our messengers, I voted for this.
Yeah.
The only other thing that you're going to hear about in the news is a former SBC president named Johnny Hunt. There are accusations that he sexually abused someone.
There are 4 witnesses.
4 witnesses of this. He vehemently still denies it, but you're still going to hear about this in the news, if true. And I do have a tendency to believe independent reports. And I would just say, if it's true, it saddens me because he has been a great blessing to me. And I'll still quote him. I will still mention him because things that he has said that were true are still true. But if true, it is a wonderful reminder that if you think you stand, beware, you're about to fall. For all of us.
Yeah. I think a highlight of the report is that, and I don't know that this has been brought out enough, there are certainly some heroes in the report.
That's true.
That amidst this culture where the executive committee was trying to squash reports of sexual assault and incidents of sexual assault, there were pastors pushing against it. J.D. Greer being one of those that I think should be applauded. I think Russell Moore,
I agree,
part of the process exposing what was going on.
Al Mohler
doing the right thing when he had a seminary professor that was involved in that. I think there are some people that did the right thing, and then there are people that are not mentioned that we know personally that were involved in bringing sexual assault accusations to light.
That's right.
Ultimately, the fact that Southern Baptists instigated a report on itself.
That's right. The Catholics should have done this.
Right.
I mean, honestly.
Right.
If you did a comparison to this, everything had to come out on the Catholics. At least what you can say about this is, we said, please bring it to us.
Yes.
And to that degree, this will, in the end, this is great. This is painful. This is troublesome. But in the end, the only way you'll ever be able to address something is if you say, show me the sin.
Yeah. And I think another thing that's helpful is that it certainly appears based on the report that the staff of the executive committee knew about these things, but the trustees did not, and were not being kept in the loop about what was going on. And a lot of our people that are voted in to run the executive committee were in the dark. and they're appalled by the things that have come to light. I don't think that we need to cast them in the same lot as some of the staff people and the attorneys that were making those type of decisions.
Right. And our feeling on the whole thing, all of us have sat I have sat in a room with Johnny Hunt. I've learned from him. He's been instrumental in a lot of pastors' lives in the convention. So it's a grievous thing. I mean, it's one of those things you just hate. So we don't tell the story to pile on or anything like that. We're trying to make people aware of what's going on, and it grieves us that a brother would do that. We just hate it. Pray for him, his family.
Yeah. So how does the report impact NorthWoods Church? We'll bring it down local.
We're a Southern Baptist church, and so I think one way that this affects us is from a community perspective, we're in an unusual situation in that we don't even have Baptists on the sign, nevertheless Southern Baptist.
Right.
Okay, so people find out we're Southern Baptist most of the time, to be honest, when they come to the NorthWoods class. And then every now and then we'll mention something from the pulpit area on the stage that we are SBC on a unusual day. So it's not something that we are waving around, but it's also not something we deny. It affects us in the sense of these are our peeps.
Yeah.
And so we grieve over this. We weep over this. Does it affect anything we do on a day-to-day basis? No.
We're an independent church.
We're an independent congregation. The only thing that it's affected in my last 48 hours, this podcast is being recorded on Tuesday, the 24th. It came out on Sunday, the 22nd. And in the last 48 hours, I've probably had 6 to 10 pastors who called me and asked me what I think about things. Since I've sat here in this podcast, I've had another pastor call me. Pastors are wanting to talk to me, ask me what I'm thinking. I'm looking forward to the podcast coming out so I can send them the podcast. They're looking for something like this.
Yeah. Another thing that I think that we can clearly say is the EC is hired to represent us, and they've done a poor job in terms of sexual abuse. It's not condonable. And all of us that are sitting in on this podcast were at the Nashville convention, and all 3 of us voted for this report. Mm-hmm. And sure, I'm glad it's exposed so that we can deal with the ramifications of it.
Correct.
How should NorthWoods respond to the report?
One of the things is it confirms some of the things we're already doing. I mean, I'm so grateful the report doesn't come out and we're like, oh, we've got to change everything. The reality is we're already taking any report that we have of something like this seriously. And I've been here 5 years. We have it ever since I've been here. It's not been the sort of thing that anything has been minimized or dismissed or put on the down low, keep it quiet. We're doing what we feel like we should be doing. And so for me, it doesn't change our day-to-day operations. It is a warning to us to make sure when hiring that we're cautious. We do due diligence in all of our stuff that we do, and that we make sure we continue to operate in a way that is biblical. So for us, it doesn't change more or less the way we operate day to day. So I think that's positive.
One of the things that NorthWoods has always done right is that we have always taken sexual assault and sexual abuse seriously. And I would encourage anyone to look at our policies. Anybody can see them. And we take it seriously. We enforce those policies. We make reporting and take that very, very seriously. And we always have. And this won't change that. It's just further evidence that we're doing the right thing. We won't rehash the conversation we were having in the church office before this podcast. But one thing I'll say about that conversation is that between the 3 of us, we probably have 100 years of church experience between the 3 of us. And we've experienced every church cliche possible. We've experienced student ministers running off with teenagers and having illicit affairs with teenagers. We've experienced pastors that have had affairs with church secretaries. Not us, by the way.
None of this is about us.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But child abuse, sexual assault, you name it. People don't think that this happens in churches, but it does. And we've not just got one story on these things. We've got multiple stories on these things, which is why we have to take this stuff seriously.
Well, so this is not a Southern Baptist problem. This is a human problem.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. And so this is one of those things that if you did a study among Presbyterians, they're going to have the same problem. If you did a study among Assembly of God, they're going to have the same problem.
Yes.
This is not about Southern Baptists. That Southern Baptists have a unique sexual issue. this is sin, and this is a sin that is systemic in humans.
Yeah.
Thereby, every group has to figure out, what are you going to do with it? That's really the issue. Southern Baptists have said, well, we're autonomous, we're independent, there's really nothing that can be done. Well, I'm not sure that that's fair, because part of what the report ends up saying is you can at least give churches tools.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You can at least give churches, here's names that we know for sure to be aware of. Then it's still up to the church autonomously to make some decisions about what they're going to do. And by the way, autonomous still means that the SBC could make an autonomous decision to disfellowship from a church because that church has chosen to hire a sexual abuser. There's nothing inappropriate with that.
Yeah. And how a database would work is that either the executive committee or an independent organization maintains a database of people who have been accused or convicted of sexual deviances. And then if a church wants to hire a pastor, you just go to that database and see if that person's on there.
See if their name's there. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You want to, at that point in time, check out why they're there.
Yeah.
You also might want to completely rule them out at that point.
Yeah. Because part of the problem is, and you can Google this and you can find news reports. I'm not going to spill tea on this, but there are churches that are contacted by other churches that are hiring somebody, and they fail or refuse to disclose what has happened in the lives of the people that they have previously hired.
That's right.
And vice versa.
That's right.
And that just can't happen anymore.
Well, and there's also been a problem where many times churches have valued competency over character.
Sure.
I'll mention this person's name. They're in the report. But one of my favorite preachers when I was growing up in the late 1980s was an African-American preacher named Daryl Gilliard. And Daryl Gilliard, the first time I ever heard him was on the Jerry Falwell show. We always listened to Jerry Falwell before we went to church on Sunday morning. And that was where I first heard him. Jerry Falwell had him there, and he became connected to First Baptist Church, Jacksonville, Florida. He became connected to, I believe, Southwestern Seminary is mentioned in the report concerning Daryl. But the amount of women that he abused going from church to church in Florida was 100% an issue of his competency was great.
If you talk to any expert on sexual assault, sexual abuse, they bring up the topic of power. Sexual assault, sexual abuse always involves somebody using a position of power in order to abuse trust and then ultimately to abuse that person. And one of the things we've got to be careful of is we are shepherds of a flock.
Yeah.
And they are vulnerable sheep. And there are people that are out there that will use that position of power in order to gain advantage or to commit or perpetrate a sin in their lives. And we've got to be on the watch for wolves. Christ tells us to.
The SBC, rather than saying it's the church's responsibility to screen people out who do that, it's not our responsibility, I hope that they will take more seriously the issue of, yes, they don't have power over what happens in the church, but they can disfellowship a church if they're choosing to act in a way that's irresponsible in regard to their flock. And that there will be more people, if a church is going to go out of bounds and do these things, they're going to have to be able to say, well, then you're not a Southern Baptist church, because that's not in keeping with who we are.
Absolutely. Yeah. So just to help people understand, so does NorthWoods have policies regarding sexual abuse?
So you're going to love how I'm going to answer this, Matt.
Yeah.
The answer to that is yes. Now, Matt, you designed so many of those policies when you were family minister. So, Matt, does NorthWoods have sexual abuse policies?
Absolutely, yeah. The most basic stuff is background checks and screening that anybody that volunteers for NorthWoods Church, from whether they're serving in the nursery, whether they're serving on security team or any capacity, we background check those people and make sure that they don't have a criminal history or criminal record. And a lot of people, that's a good starting point, because a lot of people, they won't try to pierce that veil if they have already perpetrated some sort of crime and they know that you're going to check those things. I'd encourage every church to do that. In fact, a church plant that we had just came back to us, and I guess, I don't know what to call it, we're replanting them. And one of the things we told them right off the bat is, you need to background check all your volunteers.
Yeah, and they were shocked.
If you are not background checking your people, you have to. That's a good first step. We also have a set of policies about who can be with children, how many people need to be present with children, and then what circumstances they can be with kids. We don't let adults be alone with children. We don't allow our volunteers to take other people's children to their home. That discounts things like if you have a child of your own and you're having a birthday party or something like that. But if you're a youth leader, you shouldn't have a teenager over to your house alone. That could be conceived as and could legitimately be grooming type of behavior that a lot of people do. And so we take a lot of care with who can be with your kids and how many people need to be with your kids, and under what circumstances people can be with their kids. The days where you could just invite a teenager over to your house are gone. At my last church, there was an older gentleman who was always talking about, let's bring back bus ministry, where we just go out into neighborhoods and say, hey, kids, come get on the bus and come to church with us. Back 50 years ago, churches did that. They went to random neighborhoods and say, hey, kids, get on the bus. And the kids wouldn't tell their parents where they were going. They would just get on the bus. You can't do that nowadays. Right. I mean, it's just days gone by. But the other thing that we do is we train our people extensively on sexual abuse and what to do. Who's a mandatory reporter, which is everybody, and how to report sexual abuse, sexual assault, child neglect, all of those things. And we help people in reporting those things. And I will say that it doesn't happen often, but we make reports of sexual abuse.
Yeah, and I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong. There have been years where we've 5 to 10 times a year, we've made those phone calls.
Yes. We are not the police. We are not here to figure out whether a crime has occurred. That's really why I think some churches get into trouble, is that before the police or DCS or whoever is in charge gets called, the church wants to try to figure out whether a crime has actually occurred.
We're not investigators.
We're not investigators. Our job is to report to the people that figure out whether a crime has occurred.
Right.
The other thing that I think that we do a good job with here at NorthWoods Church is we have biblical counselors that are on staff and within our congregation. And on a compassionate end, as I think that we do a good job helping people who have experienced sexual assault and sexual abuse. And we've counseled people through it and helped them in their suffering. And I would like to think that we are a church that wants to help people overcome what they have been through the power of Jesus Christ.
Right. Well, and this is not a policy, but I think one of the things we also try to do is to make it as least likely as possible that there are spaces where this kind of thing that can happen. We have a safety team here. We have cameras all over the building trying to look at spaces that we have. If we ever heard of somebody coming on our campus who may have a history with this, we have cameras. We keep an eye on people. We have made people keep eyes on somebody that we know has had a history. Even if they're visiting here, we try to keep a watchful eye on those things. All of us have, in all of our offices, we have cameras where we know when we are in our offices that there are eyes on everything that we do. That's not something that the elders have said, you guys need to do this. That's something that we've said, we want this to protect us because we don't want there to be a situation where this could ever happen. So those kinds of things are not policy, but they are things that I think can keep people safe.
Yeah, I think cameras and having that system is important, and that's helped us a lot over the years, having that camera system. You know, whenever I counsel anybody, the first thing that I'll tell them is look in the corner. There's a camera recording this. You can feel safe that nothing's going to happen in this room that's not being recorded.
Yeah, that's right.
So should people have confidence that NorthWoods will handle sexual abuse properly?
I would just simply say yes. I think we have good systems. And I think that the most important thing people need to understand is if you say that you have been sexually abused or we have any indication of that, people need to understand we're going to make a phone call to DCS when there's kids involved.
Yeah, 100% of the time.
When in doubt, we call. People just need to know that because we believe that's what the law is telling us to do. We also would say that's what's right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
DCS can do with it as they wish. We are still going to care for their soul, and we're going to care for who they are in Christ, no matter what happens after that phone call.
Yeah.
But I think the answer to that is yes.
Yeah. You got to think about it. A lot of times, how much people share about sexual assault or sexual abuse that has occurred to them will largely be determined by the first person that they tell. If they work up the courage to tell somebody, and the first person that they tell either doesn't believe them or makes fun of them or discourages them or makes them feel even more shamed, then they're probably not going to tell anybody else. Then we want to be the place where people can come to us and talk about these things. It's the right thing to do, is to be encourage the faint-hearted, as Scripture says. So how should Christians respond when their mentors or respected leaders have a moral failure? I think that's a big part of this report as well. And we see it more and more that pastors that we respect having an infidelity or moral failure.
I know what I'm doing after reading the report is just grieving. Like, for us, we glory in no one's sin, not even somebody I disagree with, no leader that was megachurch, this or that. We grieve that as sin. We take warning. I think for me, anyone who thinks you stand, take heed lest he fall. Be careful, watch yourself. And so for me, those situations that as I was reading the report, it was just grievous to me to think about these people, that many of these that we know that have been in our state, that we've interacted with, that these are people we care about, and they're people, I'm presuming, that are trying to run the race the same as us. So one of the things is I think you grieve that appropriately, and where there's any adjustments that need to be made in terms of your practices, I think we certainly have to make sure we address that stuff.
To answer in the reverse, you're not happy. And there are people who hear about people's failures and sort of have a fold the hand and I knew it happened. That's just not where I'm at. Since the report came out, I read about the first 50 pages Sunday afternoon and just had to stop. And yesterday I finished. I read, it's a 288-page report, and we've all three read it. I moved from anger to grief and from grief to anger. And not mad at a person. When I'm mad at seeing the effects of this sin. This has not been an enjoyable couple of days.
Yeah.
Because we do know some of these, like Darin and I have sat in on the lawyer who really did a lot of the covering up. I've sat under his training.
We know virtually all these people. I mean, Southern Baptist life is a small world.
I know these guys and have been so disappointed in the names that are there. And I'm intentionally not giving them at this podcast.
Sure. Read the report for yourself.
Read the report for yourself if you really need to. But I'm just telling you, guys, these are people who I would not have thought coming.
I'll have a moment of honesty amongst other pastors with the audience listening as well. But this is an area that's hard for me. And I feel grieved sometimes. Like 15 years ago, I was whole in on Mark Driscoll. Really was helped by a lot of his ministry and a lot of what he was doing, and even showed some videos of his preaching without cussing to congregations and youth groups and things like that. And then what do I do with that now?
Yeah, right.
That's hard. Like you, I mean, I vacillate between grief and anger and just not knowing how to handle some of these things. Yeah. It's hard, especially when I've showed a congregation a particular video or a teaching, and you feel some responsibility for that. And I'm not sure how to digest all of that sometimes.
Sure. In closing, to NorthWoods Church, knowing this is the NorthWoods Church Matters podcast, to our congregation, we are a Southern Baptist church, but we are an autonomous, independent congregation that makes its own decisions. And I don't mind saying this. We follow Jesus before we follow any other convention of churches.
Yeah.
And that will always be the case. And if a convention of churches, or if a denomination that we're a part of, ever goes awry from Scripture, we're going to stay with Scripture. I love SBC.
Yeah.
But I'm just telling you, it's Jesus first.
Absolutely.
Sure.
It's Jesus first. And it will always be that way. It'll be Jesus first.
Yeah. And I think something that needs to be said, and NorthWoods Church has not been involved directly in the abuse of any of these people that have been named in the report, but the executive committee was hired to represent us. And from that perspective, I am so grieved and hurt by what happened.
Yeah, I agree
and
with that.
ashamed.
Amen. Yeah, that's right.
And this may be the first podcast I've ever done where I would just want to cry over it. I mean, it's just awful.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry if anybody who's out there is remotely involved in this and is listening. I am so sorry that this happened to you.
That's right.
And I'm grieved by it, and our staff is grieved by it. And
Mm-hmm.
I want to make sure that this never happens to anybody here at NorthWoods.
Yeah, we agree.
Right.
Yeah.
We agree.
Thanks for tuning in to the NorthWoods Church Matters podcast. If you'd like to find out more about NorthWoods Church, you can visit us at our website, www.northwoodschurch.org. Again, that's www.northwoodschurch.org.